Benjamin Netanyahu calls it a very bad deal. Donald Trump says it's the worst deal ever. Both leaders would love to tear up the Iran nuclear agreement, but will doing so lead to a new war in the Middle East? That's our debate. But first, I'll talk to the former president of Malawi, Joyce Banda, about corruption, aid and democracy in Africa. Joyce Banda, thanks for joining me on UpFront. In July of this year, Malawi police secured an arrest warrant against you over alleged abuse of office and money laundering offences as part of the estimated $250 million corruption scandal known as Cashgate, which erupted in 2013 when you were president. It's been over 3 years since you left office and left the country. Do you plan to return to Malawi to try and clear your name?
I intend to plan to return to Malawi, but maybe let me get back to your question. There was no warrant of arrest that was issued by the Malawi police. It was a press release announcing that they had a warrant of arrest. Up until now, that was in July, up until now, there's no warrant of arrest. What happened that day, I was on my way home. I had completed my fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I phoned Malawi on the 31st of July at 11 o'clock in the morning that I would be returning to Malawi and speaking to the Chief of Staff of the of the Office of the President Cabinet. The same day, 5 hours later, there was an announcement that there would be a warrant of arrest. Up until now, the warrant of arrest has not been issued.
Okay, so no warrant of arrest.
There's no warrant
an announcement of a warrant of arrest, but also lots of allegations from former colleagues of yours who have accused you of being involved in corruption. Former colleagues of yours who are now behind bars, convicted, they're saying, but you were involved too. You know that, you've heard them say it.
Yes.
What do you say
in response? And I can give you evidence that when I was in office, 2 years I came in to complete the 2 years of the former president. And the first 3 years was the genesis of the corruption of the 2 years that I stayed in office. There is now a forensic audit supported and funded by the German government that shows that 577 billion kwacha was stolen in the first 3 years. When I came in for my 2 years, I asked, and I was alerted by the European Union ambassador, that the integrated financial management system was being abused. And on the 7th of September 2013, I made an announcement to the nation that I had been alerted and I would be taking action. During that period, is the period that I arrested 72 people. And I asked the British government to fund a forensic audit. And I want you to tell me how many presidents in Africa will conduct a forensic audit in their government during their time. And that audit report by the Baker Tilly audit firm is a public document online. And that document vindicated me. It was a year after, then 6 months after the release of that report, after I left office, that it was clear in Malawi that they were now pressurizing those that we had convicted and were already serving sentences.
So these people who are members of your party, members of your government, you're saying they were either pressured or they're lying? They
were pressured, and I have evidence. But not only that, you must know that they were arrested in 2013 November. And we spent a year, and we had elections, and I left office. And 6 months after that, the report, the Baker Tilly report, was officially released. It was after that report was released that then they started mentioning my name.
Just to be clear, for the sake of our viewers watching around the world, what kind of evidence are you talking about? That you say you have evidence. What kind of evidence?
I have evidence that people will swear under oath that were approached also to implicate me.
And you're going to take that evidence back to Malawi with you? You're planning to return to Malawi?
Yes. I mean,
so you're going to fight to clear your name?
I don't have to clear my name, because Malawians know what I did, and my conscience is very clear.
Today, you are a very well-known, very respected activist and speaker on development. You gave a lecture in September last year, for example, entitled Moral Leadership, the Prerequisite for Economic Growth, Development and Peace in Africa. Wouldn't it help your cause and your credibility to speak on these important subjects, as you do, if you were able to completely put all of these allegations to bed? I know you don't like the phrase clearing your name, but to completely end any cloud that surrounds you on this subject. Surely you would agree.
It's not easy. When you fight corruption, that is why my position is that going forward as Africa, those that stick their neck out to say, I am going to fight corruption, and conduct a forensic audit in their government during their time, like I did, must be encouraged and supported. Because you fight very strong people, and they fight you back, and they smear that back onto you. And so at the end of the day, for me, it doesn't matter. What I know is I don't need anybody to pat me on the back, because I know what I did, and there are a lot of people that know what I did, and that I will continue for as long as I live to raise my voice against corruption.
So let me ask you this. Many commentators say that Cashgate was not only behind your loss in the 2014 presidential election to Peter Mutharika, the current president, but that you also tried to annul that election. You did try and annul that election. And people say that's because you were worried, you knew that Mutharika was going to throw these charges at you. That's why you tried to annul the election.
The Electoral Commission in Malawi announced that there had been fraud, and that they are going to seek for recounting. And I said, if that is the case, then I think Malawians deserve a leader of their choice. I am calling for a rerun, but I am not a candidate. Even if there had been a rerun, I was not going to run.
Are you going to run again?
No, that is not up to me. I cannot decide. It's up to Malawians.
Oh, so you're not ruling it out? You might run again?
If they want me to run again, I'll run again, but it's not a priority for me. It doesn't matter. I believe that if you're a leader and you're serving your people, you don't have to be in State House. You can serve your people at any level, at any rate.
Let's talk about the economy and poverty, issues you've made a lot of contributions on since leaving office for the Club de Madrid and others. When you came to power in 2012, you inherited a shattered economy, no doubt about that. One of your first moves as president was to accept the IMF-led recovery measures that your predecessor had resisted, which included a 49% devaluation of the Malawian currency, a measure that many experts say hit the poorest Malawians hardest. There was a skyrocketing in the price of basic commodities by as much as 50%. There was panic buying, there was protests on the streets. Looking back, do you regret buying into the IMF treatment plan for your country?
No. I don't think you're being fair to Malawians.
Okay.
The truth of the matter is that I had to make very hard decisions. Do we devalue the kwacha by 49%? Do we get back on course with IMF? The economy had grown by 1.8%. 35 companies were operating at that 5%. There was money for only 1 week. 2 million people had no food. 675 women were dying giving birth. So therefore, for me, do I take these hard decisions? There's one lesson that I learned, is that when you're a leader, you must be all-inclusive. I organized what we called the National Dialogue on the Economy. And there we picked only 5 sectors, because I had only 2 years to go. In any case, you have to listen to what the people say. But also as a leader, engage the people. I have learned as a leader that when you engage the people, they'll stand with you and by you. And by you, what you should be looking at is then what was the situation of the economy when I exited, and what is the situation of the economy today. Because we had grown by over 6% from 1.8. When I came in, there were no lights, there was no water. When I left, we had water and electricity all the time. And we overproduced our food by 1 million metric tons. And companies were operating at 85% and recruiting again.
You're proud of your economic record.
So I am proud of the efforts that I made.
Okay. And since leaving office, you've dedicated yourself not only to women and minority rights initiatives, but to development work, to the Club of Madrid, to advancing democracy. You've argued that what Africa really needs is not aid, but trade. But you've also had first-hand experience as President of Malawi of aid, and Malawi is a country, it's a very aid-dependent country. At what point will we be able to say that Africa has outgrown aid, that countries like Malawi have outgrown aid?
Do you know, in 2001, a minister in Malawi said, Malawi is losing 30% of its aid through mismanagement and corruption. In 2006, that same minister said that and was sacked. In my opinion, Malawi gets 40% of its budgetary support from aid. If we save 30% from corruption, all we will want to find is 10%. Malawi is not poor. And so let me speak general about Africa. Africa is not poor. We are rich in our natural resources. So what we need to do, in my opinion, is to set our priorities right. Is to sit down and say, how can we best use our natural resources for the benefit of our people? So I have a dream that one day we shall have diamonds for cash, gold for cash in poor households, that a country that is rich in diamonds will give into their poor households $5,000 a year, so all girls in that school and boys go to school or enjoy better health. So in my opinion, Africa can move forward without aid if they can just set their priorities right. Not that aid is not important, but it looks like where we are going, we don't have a choice. But what we must do is to see what is it that we can do ourselves to lift ourselves out of the difficult situations.
Joyce Banda, thank you for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
Donald Trump's reckless war of words with Kim Jong-un has many around the world worried about nuclear war. But Trump can't launch a nuke all by himself, can he? The truth might surprise you. UpFront producer Ryan Coles has this week's reality check.
Everyone values a good night's sleep, so it would be nice to think there's some sort of check on Donald Trump's authority to launch nuclear weapons. But here's a wake-up call. If the US president wants to start a nuclear war all by himself, nobody can stop him. He has the sole authority to launch the United States nuclear arsenal. That's hundreds of nukes ready to fly within just 5 minutes of Trump's order. Yes, launch officers work in pairs, codes have to be authenticated. No one can go rogue and launch a nuke, except the president. If you think there are other checks and balances, you're not alone. When asked in a poll, 44% of Americans said they think Trump needs to ask Congress before launching a nuke. Now, a few US lawmakers who are worried about Trump's rhetoric have sponsored legislation that would require congressional approval for a preemptive nuclear strike. But that bill is stalled in Congress, and even if it did move through, Trump probably wouldn't sign a bill taking his thermonuclear toys away. 32% of Americans also think Trump needs to confer with military advisors or cabinet officials. But if he wants to launch an atomic weapon, not even a Secretary of Defense can do anything about it. As William J. Perry once remarked, nobody has the right to countermand that decision. When former US President Richard Nixon was nearing the end of his presidency, his advisors started to get worried he might start a nuclear war. President Nixon was depressed, drinking heavily, and frightening members of Congress with odd comments about nukes. Even though Nixon worried US officials in the past, nothing was done about it. In fact, the US arsenal is set up this way on purpose. The US wants its adversaries to know that if the president orders a strike, that order will be followed quickly and without question. It's what they call deterrence, the idea that if your nuclear threat is credible and scary enough, your adversaries won't test you and you won't have to use it.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
And since Trump has sole launch authority, other nations watch his behavior closely. Clearly, the people who set up the system made some big assumptions, that the US president would be of sound mind and careful with his words and tweets. Sleep tight.
While the Iran nuclear deal was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy by its supporters around the world, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a very bad deal, and Donald Trump called it the worst deal ever. The US president recently decided to officially decertify what's formerly known as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, between Iran and 6 other countries. So, as the historic deal hangs in the balance in the US, will the other 5 signatories follow Trump's lead? And would the deal's unraveling lead to a new war in the region? Joining me to discuss this are Trita Parsi, founder and president of the National Iranian-American Council and author of the new book Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran and the Triumph of Diplomacy, and from Los Angeles, Danny Ayalon, former Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister and former Israeli Ambassador to the US. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Danny, let me start with you. You've been a staunch critic of both Iran and the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. You welcomed President Trump's decision to decertify the deal in October because, as you said at the time, it creates an opportunity to fix it. What is it about the deal that you think needs fixing?
I think that the JCPOA lacks in 2 major things. First of all, it does not include Iran's terrorism, support of terrorism throughout the region, trying actually to subvert and in many ways to disrupt everything that goes in the region. And the second thing is the ballistic missiles that they continue to test. And with the cooperation that they have with North Korea, and we know North Korea just this week have launched the most powerful ballistic missiles so far, this creates a very, very dangerous situation. So I would say, to sum it up, we're all dependent right now, because of this agreement, on the goodwill of the Ayatollahs.
And before I ask Trita to respond to that, just to be clear for the sake of our viewers, because you're criticizing parts of the deal and you're saying the deal itself is inadequate, are you saying that the deal needs to be amended, or are you saying it needs to be scrapped?
Well, I think realistically, I don't see it being scrapped. We have to remember that it has 6 parties vis-a-vis Iran. So it's not just the United States. It will be very, very hard to bring the Europeans on board, let alone Russia and China. But definitely, I think we can do some fixings. I think it's also the interest of all the other parties as well.
Trita Parsi, Danny Ayalon says that you cannot have a deal that works that depends on the goodwill of the Iranian government. A lot of people listening to that, even if they don't support the Israeli line on the Middle East, will say that's a very fair point. How do you have a deal that's based on the goodwill of Iran's government?
Because you don't have a deal that is based on the goodwill of the Iranian government. You have a deal that has put on Iran the most intrusive inspections and limitations that ever has been achieved. Fortunately, thus far, 9 IAEA reports have made it very clear the Iranians are living up to every aspect of the deal, and the IAEA has the access that they need. It is not based on their goodwill. I think it's important to understand, if the United States, through Congress right now, tries to change the deal, even if it's an attractive change from the US or from the Israeli perspective, it is a violation of the deal if a single country goes in and just tries to change the terms of this deal. So if one is concerned about not scrapping the deal, it makes me very curious, why are we then doing things that would ensure that the deal will get scrapped?
Well, I would say, unfortunately, the situation is not as sanguine as Trita describes, because military installations are exempt. And in any case, the IAEA inspectors have to give enough time. They cannot do just random and surprised checks. So the Iranians have ample time to disguise whatever they do. Also, we don't know what we don't know.
Trita.
Look, from the Israeli perspective, there's been a history of making demands that are simply completely unrealistic.
You're saying Israel makes unrealistic demands on the inspections front. What about the ballistic missiles that Danny mentioned?
On every front.
But that's not just the Israelis. Ban Ki-moon, when he was Secretary General, said he was concerned Iran's missile launches were not consistent with the constructive spirit of the nuclear deal. The French, the British, the Germans have all made noises about the fact they're not happy that Iran keeps test firing these ballistic missiles. That's not exactly helpful or conducive to keeping the deal.
It's certainly not helpful, but at the same time, you have to understand that security doesn't go one way. The Saudis right now are outspending Iran with a factor of 5 to 6 on military spending. You cannot expect Iran to not have any defenses. What we can do, however, is to learn from the diplomatic experience that we've had here. There's only one example in the last 37 years in which we have seen the West being able to change dramatically one of Iran's core policies, and that's through these negotiations. What the change happened in the nuclear deal. So if everything else has failed. So if we want to address the ballistic missile issue that I agree with you, many countries have concerns about, there's a path for it. Okay. The path is through diplomacy. So we could have additional negotiations to address those issues.
Okay.
But that's not what we're doing right now. We're trying to scrap the deal.
I want to come back to the diplomatic angle and whether, this option of are we heading towards a new conflict. Before I get to that point, Danny, I have to ask you, I mean, there's no point saying, the Iranians don't allow inspections, the Iranians aren't transparent. Israel actually has nuclear weapons and doesn't allow anyone to come and inspect its nuclear facilities. Isn't it a bit hypocritical for your country to be leading the charge against Iran's non-nuclear weapons program as it is now?
Well, Mari, that's a good question, but not really. First of all, Israel's, let's say, long tradition policy has not changed, that Israel will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East. So next to that, Israel is a democracy with checks and balances, and also Israel is the only country in the world that its existence has been threatened. when the Ayatollahs threatened to erase Israel, or when Saddam Hussein at the time did, or many others, whether it's Hezbollah or...
I understand the Israeli defensive posture. I'm not questioning that. I'm simply asking a simple question. The UN Resolution 487, for example, calls upon Israel to place its nuclear facilities under the safeguards of the IAEA. Iran is having intrusive IAEA inspections, as Trita points out. You say you want even more intrusive inspections. I'm saying, why not level the playing field and say, you know what, why not set a good example to Iran and say we're going to allow all the inspectors from the IAEA to come into our nuclear facilities where we have actual nukes, not hypothetical nukes, actual ones?
Well, I would say because formality, I would say, and the legal arguments is on our side. Israel has never signed, and we are not a party to the non-proliferation NPA. And Iran is. So Iran is subject to the inspections and to the regulations of the NPT. What we have seen that actually, while it was a member of NPT, they cheated and broke and violated every commitment that they had. Israel does not have any commitments or obligations, and simply this is the core of our national security policy because of the situation we are in.
Trita, do you want to respond to Israel doesn't have the same legal obligations that Iran does?
Well, precisely because Israel is outside of the NPT, it makes it very difficult for Israel to criticize the IAEA and their inspections of Iran and what Iran is doing. What you essentially are saying is that the rest of the region is at the mercy of the goodwill of the Israeli government. The same argument that you falsely used against Iran. There's not a single report by the IAEA pointing out that Israel's nuclear program is peaceful. So the fact that the Iranians have now signed this agreement, is allowing all of these inspections inside of their program, is really putting Israel in a very, very uncomfortable position in which the hypocrisy of its policy is becoming very, very clear.
Danny.
Yeah, well, I would say that there is no way to have any moral equivalency between Iran and Israel. Also, by the way, Israel has never threatened any of its neighbors or any other country.
Israel has been occupying another country for more than 60 years now.
But on the other hand, we have the Iranian Ayatollahs. We know that they have been cheating. We know that they are subverting and actually supporting terror throughout the region.
I've got to ask you, Danny. Israel has nuclear weapons, doesn't it? Everyone in the world knows Israel has nuclear weapons.
Well, I can only repeat our long tradition, a statement that we will never be the first to introduce nuclear weapons.
We'll take that as a yes.
Middle East.
So let me just ask you this then. A lot of Israeli officials, you're here criticizing the deal. You could be the one who's leading, your position could be the one that leads to more deaths and more war, because getting rid of the deal leads inevitably to a new war in the Middle East in which Iranians die, Israelis potentially die, Americans die, etc. What's your response to that?
When I look in history, and without exception, when you had a tyrant, a dictatorial and very, very aggressive regime, ideologically aggressive regime as the Iranians, if you must decide on a war or let them getting more strength, I think the first option is the former is much better. Had Hitler been stopped in the early 30s or the mid-30s, maybe the lives of 60 million people would have been saved. This is the same situation right now. And I would have another question, maybe for Trita.
But essentially you're arguing for war then, because you're essentially saying that as long as Iran is ruled by this government, you cannot do anything else but actually cut down their power, which essentially means going to war. That is the argument you're presenting.
I would ask, why would Iran, why were they so adamant about not including limitation to their ballistic missile tests? If the Iranians understand that by continuing their ballistic testing, by continuing trying to topple every regime which is not in their liking, whether it's in the Saudi Arabia or any other Sunni country, then they would be under severe sanctions again. I believe there would be a pressure also from the population, who has suffered a lot under the sanctions, to have the government change its course.
Isn't the problem, Trita, that when Danny says these things about the Iranian government, a lot of populations, journalists, politicians hear that and say, yeah, that's true, that is part of the problem, that we've done this deal with a regime we don't like, with a government we don't like, which is clearly committing all sorts of human rights abuses which aren't covered by the deal, which is supporting a pretty vicious and violent violent government in Syria and destabilizing that part of the world in their eyes. And that's what's undermining trust in this
First of all,
deal.
when it comes to human rights, you're absolutely right. This is a government that is engaged in tremendous human rights violations right now. But the population in Iran supported this deal overwhelmingly. You can't make the argument that, oh, this was a deal with the Ayatollahs. The population was fully backing this deal. They were dancing in the streets when the deal was struck. They wanted this because they want to break out of their isolation. They want to have better relations with the West. They want to be able to connect. And they can't as long as hardliners in Israel and in Iran and in Saudi Arabia are pushing things towards a confrontation that further isolates the population and further increases the repression that they're facing. But if the argument is you cannot make a deal with this government because it's a bad government, then you're only going to end up making deals with governments you like. Well, governments you like, you probably don't have any problems with to begin with. So what is the purpose of diplomacy there?
How worried should we be, in your view, about a new war with Iran in the Middle East in the coming years?
I'm very worried that the trajectory of things is going in that direction, and that the measures that are being argued here as fixing the deal will end up, whether intended or not, to kill the deal. And once we have no deal, we're back to the situation that existed in 2013, in which everything is pointing towards either acquiescing to Iran's nuclear program or going to war.
Danny, last word?
My last word is it all depends on the international community. If we show a strong hand against the Iranians, just as they were in I think in 2013 was a real missed opportunity, because the Iranians were begging for a deal. And if we had the P5+1 had a firmer position, we could have gotten a much better deal. And it's not late still to fix it.
We'll have to leave it there. Danny Ayalon, Trita Parsi, thank you both for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.